All right, y'all. So our next step in ecology is to talk about the cycles of matter. Okay, these are the things. These are the energy flows and the matter that's recycled within and between ecosystems. So we're going to talk about biogeochemical cycles. These are the biological, geological, and chemical aspects of the biosphere. So living, everything like rocks and like land-related soil and all that kind of stuff, and chemicals. So like oxygen and hydrogen and carbon and all those kinds of things, the chemical compounds. Okay, it's all how it passes through the earth and cycles over. So there's something called the law of conservation of matter. You might have learned about it in physics or chemistry. This basically says that matter cannot be created or destroyed. It just can be transformed. So basically, carbon molecules are never destroyed. They're just transformed and assembled into living tissue. Or when you eat food, it doesn't get destroyed. It just breaks down into different forms and either becomes part of your muscles or your body tissue, or gets passed out as waste, like poop. Okay, and that then ends up in the soil and gets decomposed and turned into more rich soil that then gets pulled up into plants and becomes part of their bodies. All right, you're essentially breathing the same oxygen atoms that dinosaurs are breathing, and you're drinking the same water that passed through their bodies, recycled, and is now going through yours. So let's talk about the water cycle. There are four main steps of the water cycle. Evaporation and transpiration are the first two. So evaporation is when liquid water changes to atmospheric gas, usually heat's involved, turning water into gas. Transpiration is when water then enters the atmosphere by evaporating from the leaves of plants. So plants take up water and then water evaporates off the bottom of their leaves. Condensation is the next step where gas condenses into tiny frozen droplets. They form clouds. And then precipitation, aka rain, when water becomes heavy enough to return to Earth. So it basically, tiny frozen droplets collect into liquid, and then it becomes heavy enough that we get rain, or snow, sleet, hail, all of those things that fall from the sky. Go ahead and pause the video, watch your copy of the water song, and then we can move on. Yeah. You probably don't even need to watch it now because you'll see it in like one of the next activities. I apologize ahead of time for the lameness of the song. Yeah. The nutrient cycles are all the chemical substances that organisms need to sustain life, aka the body's chemical building blocks. Every living thing needs nutrients to build tissues and carry out essential life functions. Like primary producers get them from inorganic forms in their environment. We consumers get them from eating other organisms. Like water, nutrients are passed between organisms and the environment through biogeochemical cycles. Carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus is what we're going to be talking about today. Oxygen basically hitches a ride with a lot of these elements and cycles through with them. The carbon cycle is the key is so carbon is the key ingredient to living tissue. We're all made up of carbon. Everything living has carbon in us. Calcium carbonate is important for animal skeletons, like our bones. It's also found in lots of rocks. Carbon dioxide is important in the atmosphere. When we breathe out carbon dioxide. The carbon cycle is mainly carried out by carbon dioxide. That's what kind of fuels it. There are four main types of processes overall. There's biological processes, so the living things like photosynthesis, respiration, decomposition. It's all about take in and release of carbon. Geochemical processes, so things like erosion and volcanic activity. It's about the release of carbon in that case. There's the mixed biogeochemical process, so it's like when living organisms or dead organisms are buried in decay into inorganic compounds, and then they're converted into fossil fuels that store carbon. Um, and then human activities where we mine, cut, burn forests and fossil fuels, and we release carbon. So here's a picture of the carbon cycle. Again, so animals and plants, like plants get carbon from the ground, they store it in their bodies. Organisms then eat carbon and store it in our bodies. And when we die and when plants die, we decompose and we store that carbon in the ground as coal and marine and sediment deposits. Okay, then that basically can either be erupted using like volcanoes and stuff like that and put out in the air as carbon dioxide, or it can be mined by human activity and turned into fossil fuels, which is then burned when we use our cars or factories or whatever, and we produce carbon dioxide and put it out into the atmosphere. The ocean also has its own cycle. Okay, so you can watch this video how humans disrupted a cycle essential to all life. Basically, the idea is that we've sort of perverted the carbon cycle because it's sort of a self-fixing cycle when we're talking about the animals, plants, and bio, and erupting volcanoes and all kinds of stuff. It self-corrects for itself because it's a cycle. The problem with us is that we've done fossil fuels, which is we're burning stuff that's supposed to store all of these carbon deposits, and we're instead burning it and we're releasing it as carbon dioxide. So there's more that we're putting back into the air than we're taking in, is basically the idea. So we have to get a hold on that because we're messing. So watch the video, and then we'll move on to the nitrogen cycle. So all organisms need nitrogen to make amino acids, which build proteins. Many different forms of nitrogen occur naturally in the biosphere. Nitrogen gas is 78% of our atmosphere. And then we have things like ammonia, nitrate ions, nitrite ions that are all found in waste and in dead and decaying organisms. It also exists in oceans and large water bodies, and we add nitrogen in fertilizers, okay, which makes soil richer and improves like the produce and like plant life that we get out of it. So we get better food supply. Only certain types of bacteria use nitrogen in gas form, legumes like beans and stuff like that. Nitrogen fixation is when they take nitrogen gas and they turn it into ammonia. And then other organisms convert gas into nitrates and nitrites, which are then used to make proteins, basically. Plants use ammonia, nitrates, and nitrites to make proteins, basically. And they put that in their plants, in their bodies, and then we eat the plants and we use the nitrogen for our own proteins, and so on and so forth. Denitrification is when the soil bacteria converts nitrates into nitrogen gas. So instead of it like goes the other way around. Okay, we turn something solid into gas. And when organisms die, decomposers break down our tissue to make ammonia, and then bacteria turns that into gas. Okay, so there's a whole cycle to this. Okay, basically, plants and animals die, decomposers turn it into ammonium, bacteria then turns it to nitrites, and then nitrates. They're different chemical structures, so that's what the name is about. And then plants take up all that stuff and put it back into the plants, which animals then eat, and then goes back into the cycle. Nitrogen fixing bacteria also takes gas and turns it into nitrates and nitrites and ammonium and stuff like that, it goes back into the cycle. And then there's denitrifying bacteria, which takes nitrates and turns it into gas, which goes into the air. So it's all part of a circular cycle. Phosphorus is needed as part of DNA and RNA. It's not really common in the biosphere. It's not in the atmosphere. It stays in rock and soil and minerals and ocean sediments and all that stuff as inorganic phosphate. It's released when rocks and sediment break down, okay? Some of the phosphorus cycles between organisms and soil, like plants absorb it from soil and water, put it into their bodies, and then as it moves up the food web and we eat them and all that kind of stuff, and then when we die, it then goes back into the soil and the rock. Some goes into rivers and streams and dissolves in water and then ends up in the ocean, so marine organisms can use it. So check out this video on nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, please. Okay. And then nutrient limitation. So basically, when we have organic matter, right, created by producers, they're limited in terms of how many plants can grow, because nitrogen and phosphorus are limited. Mainly phosphorus in fresh water. In oceans, nitrogen is the one that's limiting. But generally what happens is that plants can only make so much plant because they either don't have enough phosphorus if they're on land, or if they're in the water, they don't have enough nitrogen. And that basically keeps them from overproducing. Now, what we do as humans, farmers add fertilizers to our crops. So we boost productivity. So we add more nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium artificially. Now, the problem with that is that when we, like put a bunch of water on our farms and stuff like that, the fertilizers can run off, and they run off into aquatic ecosystems. And then we basically are giving all of these aquatic ecosystems a ton of nitrogen, which, remember, is limited in water sources. So what happens is we just toss them a ton of nitrogen by, having it run off from our farms, and all of that basically means we have an algal bloom, and that can destroy an aquatic environment because there's too much plant, and that too much plant can choke off the other organisms that live there. Okay, and it has a really negative impact on the ecosystem. So what does climate have to do with all of this? Well, first, climate is temperature, rain, and other environmental factors that combine to produce weather and climate. Weather is the day-to-day condition at a particular place and time. Climate is the average year-round conditions of temperature and rain in a particular region. So this has to do with the heat trapped by the atmosphere, latitude, transport of heat by the wind and ocean currents, shape and elevation of the landmass, like if they're mountains or if it's a valley, and the amount of water or rain we get, or snow, depending on where you are. The energy of incoming sunlight drives the weather and then determines the climate, depending on where it is, like that location. The greenhouse effect is how the atmosphere provides insulation, so it keeps temperatures on Earth suitable for life. The ozone layer prevents too much heat from escaping, basically. All the carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, and other kinds of gases help maintain the temperature range so we can live on this planet. The greenhouse effect is when we have heat retained by this layer of greenhouse gases, and it basically sunlight hits the surface of the Earth, is converted to heat energy, and when it radiates out into the atmosphere, the gases prevent the heat from passing out as quickly. So if not for the gas, Earth would be 30 degrees cooler than it is today. The effect of latitude, basically, the Earth is tilted on an axis. So solar radiation hits at different parts of the Earth's surface at an angle, and that angle changes throughout the year. So in the summer, California, for example, gets a lot more heat because the Earth is tilted so that California is closer to the sun, okay? And we get more of the heat. And then in winter, the Earth is tilted so the bottom part of the globe is closer to the sun, and they get more heat. So that's why it's cooler in winter over here, and then it's warmer in the summer because of our axis. The equator is where the sun is almost directly overhead at noon all year round. The poles, the sun is much lower in the sky for several months at a time. So the difference in latitude, where we are in terms of the axis, affects heat distribution and creates climate zones. As a result of the differences in latitude and the angle of heating, Earth has three main zones. There's the polar, which is the north and south poles, the temperate area, which is between the polar zones and the tropics, where we are more affected by the angle of the sun. Climate ranges from hot to cold depending on the season, so like here. And then tropical is like really near the equator, where it's pretty much the same climate all year round, almost always warm, direct sunlight, totally. We're kind of on the borderline for the tropics, so we tend to get more heat than, let's say, Boston or Washington, the state Washington. They tend to get more distinct seasons versus us, but we still get kind of seasony stuff versus like the equator. If you're in the rainforest, it's just hot and muggy all year round. Okay, so heat transport in the biosphere. So unequal heating of the surface drives our wind and ocean currents, and this transports heat throughout our planet. Wind forms because warm air rises and cool air sinks. So think about a car, right? If you're in a car on a hot day, the higher you are in your car, the hotter the air is. And if you're down towards the bottom of the car, it's maybe a little bit cooler. The warm, cold climates therefore cause air currents, which is like wind, and that moves heat from the cold regions to the warm regions. And winds bring warm or cold air to a region, that affects the climate. So similar patterns happen in the oceans. Ocean currents are caused by water flow. Cold water moves to the warmer regions and it rises when it gets there. It sinks when it's cold at the poles and all that kind of stuff. It's called upwelling. And surface water is moved by the wind. Basically, the transport of heat to surface ocean currents warm and cool air above them, which then affects the weather and the climates of the nearby land masses. And I believe that is it for this PowerPoint. So thank you so much, guys.